My name is Eward Driehuis, Vice President at Threat Fabric, and I'm here in Delft, one of the oldest cities in the Netherlands. I'm in the Vakwerkhuis, this beautiful industrial environment. I'm going to speak to Jake Norwood, working at Booz Allen Hamilton. He is a veteran in the threat intelligence space and has a lot of experience in building fusion teams in finance and in governments. He has a lot of war stories, and I'm also told he is an avid swordsman. Let's speak to Jake. So Jake, how long have you been in intelligence?
I've been in intelligence for 20 years now.
20 years?
20 years last week, in fact.
Seriously? That's someone sent you a watch or anything?
No, not at all, unfortunately. It's a secret.
It's a secret. But what was your first intelligence job?
I started in the U.S. Army. So I started in the U.S. Army, went to the intelligence school there, and became an intelligence officer and a tactical intelligence officer. It was long before I started working professionally in kind of the cybersecurity area. It was during the Iraq War. And so my very first intelligence job was actually training Iraqis on how to perform intelligence functions, which was a funny thing as your first job, right? To teach people how to do a thing that you've never actually done yourself. And then from there, I pivoted into unmanned aerial systems, reconnaissance, surveillance, and then ultimately targeting, hunting bad guys, as they would say.
Did you come out of university or school or whatever?
Yeah, I came out of university. Yeah, my degree originally was in linguistics. I minored in programming, which is sort of how later I ended up in cyber. But at the time, no, I wanted to be an intelligence guy and do intelligence work and be out in the field doing intelligence things. And so I came out of university. The Iraq War had just started. And so I went and signed up to go have that experience. And it was an opportunity to do this thing that I'd really wanted to do. Go to war, but be part of the intelligence.
Yeah, of course. So apparently it stuck. Right.
It did. Yeah, it did. I started there and did that kind of intelligence. And if you're in military intelligence, really every year and a half to 2 years, your job changes. So you get to do a lot of different jobs. So I worked in surveillance and reconnaissance. I worked in targeting. I worked in, true tactical intelligence where you're advising a commander on what to target, what operations to go after, who the bad guys are, what their attack patterns are. Learned all of those skills there. And it really wasn't until 2008, as I came out of active duty military service, that I stumbled into cybersecurity.
Wow. So how much in that intelligence work is, let's say, skill you can learn as opposed to, let's say, tools that you can use?
I'd like to think that tools are the least important part of the job, right? Tools come and go, and I can think of tools that I used as an intelligence analyst in 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, that are gone now. Like those tools they've vanished, right? But the tools are there to help you perform a task, to help you gain an outcome. And I think that's true for intelligence tools, it's true for cybersecurity tools, it's true for any. So really it's, the skill piece is understanding what it is you're trying to get, what the methods are to get that, what the pitfalls are in trying to get that. And so those are the things that I think you do need to as an intelligence analyst. And those are the things you need to learn to apply. If you spend, 4 years going from I'm not an intelligence person to I'm a professional intelligence person, the tools that exist at the beginning of those 4 years will be different from the tools that exist at the end of those 4 years. So focusing on tools as anything other than a wrench, a screwdriver is, I think, can be folly, right? What you want is you want to find tools that allow you to do the things you need to do, that actually enable you to perform the analysis that you're trying to perform.
Right. So you were in tactical intelligence. Is that so? How do you see that? Because you're, of course, fast forward 20 years, there's also a lot of operational intelligence that you need to leverage and automate as well as some. So where's your, how do you balance that?
So I went from tactical to strategic, and then found myself in that strategic area dragged back into operational. And so I've kind of worked at all stratifications, right, of that. They are all quite different. And I think that when we look at taking those lessons and say applying them to a corporate world, whether that's for a financial institution, which tend to have the most robust intelligence programs in the corporate world, or otherwise, tactical intelligence is all the day-to-day stuff. It's pyramid of pain stuff, right? It's looking at indicators of compromise. It's malware analysis. It's all the stuff that comes out of reverse engineering. It's identifying the way a particular threat actor acts at a point in time and what you're going to do about it right now. So it factors into threat defense engineering and the rules that your threat defense engineering team are writing to put into your SIM or whatever device you're using, whatever tool you're using there. The operational stuff, I actually like that you've mentioned automations in that piece, because to me, the operational piece is in some ways the best piece to automate. It's going to allow you to keep that operational awareness without spending an infinite amount of time trying to update those same things. So operational intelligence includes things like large scale TTPs. It includes things like threat actor profiling. It also is probably one of the best places to bring in what we think of as like internal intelligence or internal situational awareness, thinking about the way that you operate and how the way that you operate actually leads the enemy along. And I'll talk about that in a second because it's kind of cool. And then at the end, you've got strategic intelligence. And strategic intelligence is very frequently viewed as, large human readable documents, right? The 17-page paper on the war between Lockbit and Conti 2 years ago that led to, kind of the destruction of one of the biggest ransomware groups in the world. That's strategic intelligence. Why we should or shouldn't do business in a certain country based on all of this information is strategic intelligence. And so each one of these things is really important, whether you're talking about military intelligence or cyber intelligence. And there's rabbit holes galore here, but I think in the corporate world, if I think about what I learned in the military in that intelligence environment, especially working in all three of those levels in corporate world, was really very much corporate intelligence shops tend to fall into one of the three buckets too much. Right. You'll find groups that have fantastic strategic intelligence, but very frequently nobody cares. You'll have groups that have fantastic tactical intelligence, but it's so tactical that the message isn't getting out. And then that operational piece, that steady state, steady hum in the background is probably the most neglected because it's time intensive, doesn't always pay off instantaneously the way that tactical intelligence does. It doesn't brief well to executives that don't understand the domain that well. And that's probably one of the biggest glaring holes I see in the industry and corporate is that operational intelligence piece.
Are we explaining the value of intelligence enough?
No, we're not. We're not. And I think some of that is very much the fault of, it's our collective fault as a community. It's very much the fault of of intelligence being part of vendor buzzword bingo for so long, right? If you look at that stretch from maybe 2012, 2014 until about 2018, 2019, there was so many promises made by vendors, intelligence vendors of all stripes. Well-intentioned in most cases, but you'll see, the most common one was predictive intelligence. We provide predictive intelligence. Well, what are you predicting? Right? Well, we look at trends and patterns. So you're looking at, you've got indicative intelligence, maybe. We can predict. Intelligence can predict. Yeah. And so when you tell somebody we can predict, and then you fail to predict, they think, oh, well, this didn't provide the value that you promised. It's no good. So, I think that we as a community should have done a better job reining in our marketing departments and talking about that, because I think it led to kind of a burnout and kind of an eye roll. Intelligence is still really, really critical. And to some extent, intelligence is now blended into other products. A lot of tactical intelligence is just baked in to a lot of products now. And I think that's important. Seeing more operational intelligence baked into products, I think, is really the next evolution of that. Strategic intelligence is not, generally speaking, right? And I don't even know that it can be, but
good marketing tool often.
Strategic intelligence is a great marketing tool, and it does come back to that question about, are we doing enough to explain to executives, the value of intelligence? Strategic intelligence is frequently where that happens. And that's part of the reason that strategic intelligence needs to be in your program, because a lot of it is simply there to remind your executive team about what it is that intelligence does and what value it can bring to the table. But if the operators, which in our industry usually means your security operations, your incident response operations, et cetera, if the operators aren't getting actionable intelligence, meaning solid, tactical, and occasionally operational, they're not going to support you. So you got to do that dance across all three pillars.
Yeah, makes sense. So you work at Booz Allen Hamilton.
Yes.
Right? Of course, they have a huge customer base in defense as well. Yeah. Right? Is that where you made the switch?
Yeah, that is where I made the switch. I came out of the U.S. Army at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. Got hired into Booz Allen almost immediately, and this is how we stumbled into cyber. Right, so there was this new thing, cyber threat intelligence, and nobody really quite knew what it was in 2008. There were ideas. There was a brand new office in one of the three-letter agencies called the Office of Cyber Threat Analysis. I went to a job fair and handed someone my resume, and they saw intelligence officer. They looked at the bottom and they saw minor in programming, and they were like, "You come here."
We have a unicorn. We have a unicorn.
And I had two job offers on the table at the same time, and one paid more, and that was counter IED analysis, going after homemade explosives in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the other one was this cyber thing. And I thought, that looks like it has legs. I think that'll be around for a while. I'll go do that. Right. And so I worked for about 5 years doing operational and strategic cyber intelligence for three-letter agencies through Booz Allen Hamilton. So I spent a bunch of time, walking the halls of NSA, walking the halls of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've been a guest at Langley a couple of times, but mostly I just got like a mug. So I got to see these places and see what was happening in those spaces, and I got to watch cyber intelligence develop as a discipline. Right, the difference between February 2009 and February 2014, and then February 2020 cannot be overstated. People say, "Jake, why don't you have XYZ certification intelligence?" I'm like, none of that existed when I was an entry-level intelligence guy. Like, we did this stuff. We made the mistakes that led to those certifications being created. Whereas now you can hire a cyber intelligence analyst that has real dedicated training and specific skill sets and disciplines associated with cyber intelligence. Super cool. But yes, so I did that for Booz, and then it was in 2014 that I pivoted from military and three-letter agency intelligence, strategic and operational, into mostly operational and tactical cyber threat intelligence for corporate entities. And then began doing that, and eventually ended up actually going to work for one of my clients at the time.
You mentioned you think financials have the strongest threat intelligence programs apart from defense, or does that include governments?
No, it's different, right? Defense has an almost, it's obviously not limitless, but they have deep pockets for intelligence beyond what any corporation can even fathom, right? And so intelligence on the government side, on the military side, is of course the absolute front, depending on the use case. On the corporate side, in the private world, the financial industry is absolutely head and shoulders above everybody else. There are occasional exceptions, right? There's one or two retailers that have phenomenal program. There's a couple of manufacturers and oil and gas companies that have phenomenal programs that could go toe to toe with some of the larger financial services programs. But companies like JP Morgan Chase or Citi or Bank of America, all large U.S. financials, for example, are spending upwards of $1 billion per year in their cybersecurity programs. It's massive spend. I had an intelligence team when I worked for one of these top tier FIs. My intelligence team was 56 people, right? That's larger than most companies' entire CISO organization. Yeah. And then when I say most companies, I mean most companies in the Global 1000, right?
As larger than many threat intelligence vendors' teams.
Right. And exactly. Right. Exactly. I ran a 35-person threat intelligence shop from 2014 to 2017. supporting all of these tier one financials. And then I went over to one of these tier one financials and suddenly had a substantially larger team that had really deep capability.
Yeah. So how much I'm interested, how much of this, the need, the early realization and the need for threat intelligence and financials, how much of this has been driven by fraud?
So initially, almost none. The idea of bringing fraud in a committed way into the intelligence lifecycle, and that's how we kind of get into the name of this series, right? Fusion, right? Didn't really start cropping up in earnest in most places that I saw until maybe 2016 at the earliest. And listen, one of your viewers will be like, "No, I worked for such and such credit card company, and we had in in 1973." Sure, you probably did. But from what I'm aware of, right, the institutions that I worked with began using intelligence for fraud purposes at least as early as 2012. But to make this a really dedicated thing where fraud departments started really trying to get in front of the problem, left of boom, we tend to say in the intelligence world, I didn't see concerted efforts towards doing that until probably 2016 on more than a one or two kind of basis. And it's still probably the area of intelligence-led fusion operations that seems to be the most, growing the most in the financial sector.
Right. And then do you have an idea what sparked the change back in 2016?
I think it started from where I sat in the world. It started with the rise of cyber-enabled fraud. And a lot of these programs, frankly, many of these programs to this day aren't trying to solve all fraud. They're trying to solve cyber-enabled fraud, digitally enabled fraud, computer-enabled fraud. And so you've got a couple of big challenges, right? So one of the big challenges is most of the kind of fraud that we're looking at in sort of this fraud intelligence is happening at the user level. It's happening on the user's device. The CISO of your organization cannot protect the user's device. They don't have access rights, not legal. There's all kinds of things preventing them from keeping, my mother from clicking on a link and installing, banking malware onto her phone and then, giving all of her banking details, unawares to a threat actor. And so when you can't do anything about it, in the traditional way, that's one of the areas where intelligence becomes most important, because intelligence begins telling you, well, let's describe the problem. Let's describe the situation. Let's start looking for some place in the kill chain where we can apply some kind of control or some kind of pressure. And so I think that's what drove it. It was credit cards showing up en masse, in the deep and dark web. It was, credentials being stolen and traded and sold. It was individual users' bank accounts getting taken over and fraudulent purchases happening at that level. It was an attempt to try to stem the fantastic loss of money huge, right?
Yeah.
Loss of money that was happening from a vector that hadn't really existed before, right? And then I think the other big piece of that is because of some of the successes in the cybersecurity world, the fraud world, I think started to say, how can we get left of boom? Because fraud in most organizations still globally is a very much right of boom domain, right? Our fraud losses we suffered this much. It's not about trying to get in front of the fraud. Exactly. It's, fraud is a thing fraud is a thing that already happened, not necessarily a thing that's going to happen. And that's a very different mindset from cybersecurity, which is why I think cybersecurity always ends up being the beginning of any conversation about intelligence-led operations and fusion operations and so on.
Yeah. So talking about fusion, so how do you define, so you're an expert, right? You have run fusion centers. Yeah. You've implemented fusion processes in fusion centers. You've hired people to do the work in fusion centers. So you're pretty knowledgeable about this stuff. What is fusion?
Fusion is... So an Asian fusion restaurant is? I love food, right?
Yeah.
So one of my favorite, I've been when I actually started, when I started in commercial intelligence at Booz Allen in 2014, there was a food truck out in front of the office and they had Korean tacos. It was the best lunch I've ever had in my entire life. I'm still trying to find that Korean truck, right? So fusion is when you take a couple of things that didn't previously go together and you bring them together to create something that is new and in many cases superior than the sum of the two parts, right? So if we talk about cyber fusion, we're talking about bringing together disciplines that maybe aren't working together as well as you would like. Nowadays, people talk about SOC 2.0, or I've even heard one company talk about SOC 4.0. In many cases, what they're talking about is what we would probably call simple cyber fusion, which is bringing together all of the functions across your entire sort of, honestly, like NIST lifecycle, right? Your identify protections, your protect functions, your detect functions, your respond functions, et cetera. Bring them all together. So they're actually sharing information, actually talking to each other, actually working together. But they're still independent organizations. And I think that's one of the key things to underscore about fusion, right? Korean taco is a taco and it's Korean food that have been brought together, but there's still a tortilla, which is very much Mexican. And there's still bulgogi, which is very much Korean. We didn't, put them in a blender, right? And make it, just flour and beef and, bulgogi sauce. We kept those individual parts kind of in their own domain to some extent, right? So that they're each doing bulgogi is the best bulgogi it can be. That tortilla is the best tortilla that can be. You bring them together, Korean taco fusion. So when we think about fusion, it's the same idea. I want to bring together different domains. I want to share information. I want to make sure there is a workflow that doesn't care about organizational structure, that doesn't care about who reports to who, that cares about where does this information need to go. The very first fusion center environment that I ever worked in was a tactical, we called it tactical, but it was much broader than that, tactical operations center in Iraq. And there was a big printed banner that everybody could see up above all the TV screens and the projectors that said, who else needs to know? And the whole idea of fusion really comes out of the intelligence community and the law enforcement community and the international community and the post-September 11th attacks in the United States, saying we had all the intel, but we didn't share it. And so fusion is sharing despite verticals, despite silos. It's overcoming silos through sharing. And then it's creating, to use a more kind of modern consultancy term, it's using workflows that carry you through all those things so that the intelligence, you get some intelligence in, and that intelligence bifurcates and it goes to the team that does vulnerability management. Let's call it the protect team, right? And it goes to the team that writes detection logic. Let's call it the detect team, right? And then if that fires off on a detection, that information, including the original intelligence as part of that packet, goes to the respond team. And then as recovery is happening and therefore hardening in parallel to it, all of these layers of information get kept with that ticket, let's say, with that packet. So the ultimate hardening that is done both touches on what the detect team and the respond team had to do and what the protect team had to do before. And so the idea is that we give up this idea of ownership, that, this is my silo. We carry information, data, and process through all these different silos, snaking it through in a consistent, repeatable way. And the biggest development I'm seeing, and I think this is very relevant to the fraud piece, is we used to do this just by putting people in the same room. And I think that was true all the way up until, honestly, like 2014 to 2016, depending on where you were. And then we started building together true workflows, ticketing systems, whether that was in ServiceNow or in Archer or whatever, right? People begin actually building ticketing systems that would reach out to different teams and pull their content in so that intelligence is truly leading operations. And now in the last couple of years, what we're really seeing is the rise of true data-driven fusion, which is, whether that's using machine learning or in some future state, let's call it AI. Yay, yeah, right. We're using machine learning, train models, right? The stuff that nowadays we like to call AI, and frankly, bringing in some large language model techniques, let's say, I wouldn't go straight large language model quite yet, but some of those techniques in to get a lot of that what would have been tier one fusion in the past being done by people literally shouting at each other across the operations center into something that's actually happening on the back end before it ever hits Splunk or Sentinel or your SIEM or whatever else through, again, this sort of data prioritization process, right?
You make a good point about communicating across different silos.
Right.
means that also you need to speak a common language.
Yes.
Right. This might be one of the uses for, a Gen AI or a ChatGPT or whatever. But also you were previously speaking about the kill chain.
Yes.
Now, I know for a fact that different silos use different kill chains.
Yes, they do.
So what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's actually one of the biggest hurdles that we still have. And I've been in multiple organizations that have tried to solve this problem internally. And in some cases, for their own purposes, or that are close enough. You think about taxonomies, one of the organizations that I worked in was using multiple taxonomies at the same time. You've got MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is fantastic for what it does. You've got the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which is a great way of kind of grouping the way things work and looking at that. You've got you've got certain terminology that's standard to NIST and standard to ISO. And then you've got the Veris taxonomy, right? And I was in an organization that was using all of these taxonomies in different teams and had, hundreds of thousands of lines of code in homemade or modified products that relied on this. And so one of the biggest projects that we undertook was trying to write a universal taxonomy that brought all of those frameworks into one place. And then where you had two terms that meant the same thing, putting them on the same line so at least we could disambiguate. You can imagine that was an enormous project, and probably a year later it was already overcome by events, right? So this is one of the areas that I think we struggle the most. When we look at applying the approach we've taken to cyber detection to fraud and financial crime, right, to money into mules, to money laundering and so on, there is no single agreed upon kill chain yet for that. There's a couple of drafts out there. There's no framework like MITRE ATT&CK to that depth. And MITRE actually does have a sub framework for this. And there's the FSISAC is working on a framework that I really hope they publish soon, because I think it could lead the way, right? Is that base that everybody else begins slapping their components onto. But I think it's one of the largest barriers to all of us doing roughly the same thing, actually, is we don't have a good comparable framework within that silo.
Yeah, agreed. I know for a fact there's others, just like some tier one financials are collaborating with others, and vendors are working on this. And at the very least, you should roll your own in order to integrate into such a process. At least say, well, these are our definitions. Let's see where they align. But I think it's definitely time to start speaking a common language, because especially with regards to the fraud people, but coming into Fusion, right? Maybe some other processes are already used to working in this way a little bit. I've already aligned a little bit more. Now the fraud people are coming in.
Well, and this is one of the biggest. The journey into Fusion is first and foremost a cultural journey. I've got to probably update my timelines. 3 years ago, I would have said the standard goes, there's a year or two of socialization. We're going to do this, right? Then there's the first 2 years of a Fusion center, a Fusion program, which is everybody looking at each other like they're not friends and refusing to actually talk to each other. Then 2 years, then after those 2 years, right? So that's the first 2 years. The second 2 years is the awkward hug at the end of the movie Step Brothers. If you know the reference, right? Where you're like, you're hugging each other and you're kind of friends, but you're also kind of pushing each other away at the same time. You realize that this works. You realize that this is for the best for your organization, but you're still uncomfortable with how it, makes lines not as clear, and it creates certain bits of confusion. I call this the confusion center phase, right? That kind of exists, right? And then, somewhere around, it used to be around year 4. I actually think this timeline is completely different now, but somewhere around year 4, at least a couple of years ago, it just stopped, and suddenly everything worked, and you can't imagine working any other different way. I think when you bring fraud in, that's true as well, but it's even more difficult because the culture around how fraud departments operate is just different, right? A lot of financial crime, I'm using fraud and financial crime frequently interchangeably, and that's a mistake. They're not the same, but a lot of fraud or financial crime departments tend to have enormous headcount dealing with, retrospective looking at what happened, trying to understand what happened, and then put a control in that's ultimately reactive. And we're talking in some cases hundreds or even thousands of people in some financial institutions doing this after the fact. the same volume of work is being done in a security operations center by 20 to 80 SOC analysts that you've got literally 1,200 fraud analysts doing. And so part of it is this cultural change of we can use data on threat pressure, which is looking at what's actually hitting us, right? We can use data on threat pressure to shape operational intelligence. We can take external intelligence to try to understand what it is that we're seeing amongst our threat pressure, to understand what kind of threats are coming in, and to start preemptively adjusting our controls to catch certain kinds of things we weren't catching before and to prevent certain kinds of things. That is a completely foreign language to many fraud and financial crime departments. In one instance, a new fraud fusion program that I was involved in, at the end of the first year that the program actually worked, the very first year, like it's just getting figured out, right? End of the second year, third year, whatever it was, the program worked and they saved, I don't know, 27 million or something like that on fraud. And the fraud department was angry that we'd saved that many millions, because now it reduced the bank's tolerance to lose that many millions.
Right.
And so they felt like they were something accountable for a harder number to achieve.
Yeah. The prevention paradox.
Right. Exactly. Right. Well, if you prevent fraud, then our budget will go down. If our budget goes down, well, you got to cut heads. We got to cut heads. I got to lay off my friends. Like all these things happen. And it was really, really traumatic. Fast forward, that same program, recently claimed that they were saving 200 to 300 million a year in theoretical fraud losses, right? If you prevent it, you don't lose it. So it's always a little fuzzy math, but, and now they get along swimmingly with their fraud department. The culture changed. They understand what they're doing together. They understand the value that they're providing to the bank and all of that. But that is ultimately, culture is the biggest hurdle. And then right behind it is figuring out how to solve for yes in trick areas like data protection regulations, right? How do you fuse data and analyze data that you're not allowed to share with the guys in the SOC? Tough. Right, tough.
Speaking of culture, so obviously you know what it means to work in government and how to behave there. You know what it's like to work in corporates, how the rules are different, how the interaction is different. You also now know the difference between working in the US and working in Europe. Because you moved to the Netherlands, didn't you? So don't tell us a little bit about that. What sparked that change?
So what sparked that change? Moving back to Europe, I lived in Europe a long time ago. Moving back to Europe was my COVID midlife crisis, right? I think we all had this moment sometime in 2020, probably, where we were, working from home. We hadn't been outside. We hadn't seen another human in ages. We were still, spraying our vegetables with bleach when we came, and I'm sitting there staring at my computer and thinking about my life and my daughter, who was I think 14 or 15 years old at the time, walked into the room, and I thought, she's just about to start high school, the last 4 years of secondary school for the European audience, right? She's about to start high school, and oh my God, when I first got married 20 years ago, we swore that our kids would go to high school in Europe and they would have that experience, and it was this realization that just life being life had been trucking along, and I had goals from 20 years earlier that I just had not acted on. And so I literally ran to my wife that day and I said, she's 15 years old. Yeah, of course she's 15 years old. No. We were going to do this thing so that she could have this experience. And so I picked up the phone like that day and began calling around trying to find opportunities in Europe. So it was really something that was very important to me in terms of how I would raise my family, and also some quality of life things that I wanted. So I'm an unashamed Europhile. I love Europe. I've always visited, traveled here as often as I could. I lived here for a couple of years previously, and so it was really the fulfillment of a dream. Might be a little large, but certainly a life goal, right? To come back and to live and work long term, maybe permanently, here in Europe.
Yeah. And you live in The Hague, which is the capital of justice in Europe as well. So I don't know if that reflects into the atmosphere as well.
It does. The Hague has a little bit of a similar atmosphere to Washington, D.C., another city that I love and lived near for longer than anywhere else in my life. If you were to ask where I was from in the U.S., I'd probably say Washington, D.C. area. There's every town has its business, right? And New York, the business is finance. And it doesn't matter if you sweep floors for a living, you could have a conversation about finance because you've at least heard enough of them around you, right? In Washington, D.C., that business is politics. And over the last decade, I would add to that cyber and tech, or kind of Washington, D.C.'s business. Well, the Hague is a little similar. It's business, it's politics. It is the seat of the Dutch political, kind of world. There's elements from groups like NATO and the European Union and, the European Cybercrime Center and other things here like that. So you've got a similar kind of vibe. You've got diplomats here. And so there's a little bit of that Washington, D.C. feel when you would talk to somebody. And it's a growing hub for cybersecurity companies, which is part of why Booz Allen picked The Hague back in 2019 when we first decided to come to the Netherlands. Honestly, I adore The Hague. It's probably one of my favorite places, if not my favorite place I've ever lived.
Wow. And the last question I wanted to ask you does martial arts play a significant role in your life?
It does. It does. It does, and even more so, I'd say that it did. I spent about 20 years really avidly training, practicing, studying, teaching, and competing in historical European martial arts, which is a very fancy way of saying I'm a sword fighter. And so I was very, very heavily involved in that community, for about 2 decades. I'm in a state of retirement now, which is to say I'm just a simple hobbyist at this point. But yeah, I spent many years of my life dedicated to researching, rebuilding these kind of old, lost martial art forms and trying to physically perform them, sometimes for my own edification and sometimes in international competition.
Right. And so are there any parallels between threat intel and martial? I can imagine discipline and mindset.
In the 1980s, there was this big sort of Japan craze in the United States, maybe the whole Western world. I don't know. If you think about like the recent Wolverine movies and stuff, there's like sort of references to, or the Shogun series that was just out. There's these cool references to Japanese culture, and these things were the hugest thing in the world back in the 1980s. Well, there was a book written by a Japanese swordsman named Miyamoto Musashi, a book of 5 ring. And somebody decided at some point that this was a great management book. And so there was 1 million copies of this book sold in the United States in the mid-1980s on how to manage your business like a Japanese swordsman from 1610 or whenever it was, 1650, 70, something like that, whenever Musashi lived. I have definitely found myself as I have, and this is how big of a nerd I am, right? As I have been reading and translating 15th century Germanic, fencing manuals into English. You see passages or references on tactics that seem like they would certainly apply to things like cybersecurity. But I've yet to put together that TED Talk.
That's right. I said maybe a more bespoke way of looking at Sun Tzu's wisdoms.
Exactly. But there's some fun parallels, right? There was an idea at the time of what we would call operation security, that you would develop your system of defense, and they did call it defense. You would develop your system of defense, and then you would teach your system of defense to your inner circle, and you would hide that system of defense from the adversary, because if they know your tricks, they can counter your tricks. And I think that there are some really important parallels in the cybersecurity world and in the fraud world. It's a constant arms race. Every time they come up with a problem, we come up with a solution, and it keeps bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. If you think about the stuff that really terrified us let's talk, like 2017 was one of the most insane years in the whole world for cybersecurity, right? There was the WannaCry incident, which was a huge traumatic event for everybody involved. And then there was the NotPetya incident, huge traumatic event for everybody involved. Then within the financial services sector, we're familiar with the Equifax event, which was just this huge wake-up call for a lot of other organizations. And each of those has lessons, and I could dive into those for hours. But and then at the very beginning of 2018, you had a major DDoS attack, from a threat actor responding to something they didn't like that Brian Krebs had published. And in each one of these cases, it seems to me that we came within centimeters of losing the entire internet, right? For different reasons, right? A ransomware that was just replicating, until Marcus Hutchins, killed it, or a DDoS attack that shut down internet services in places from Paris to New York, right, at certain times and places. And yet, none of those things has happened since, right? And in some cases, we know from dark web intelligence that even the threat actors are like, whoa, we got too close to killing the cash cow. Like, let's all calm down. But you know, companies like Akamai and Arbor have done an incredible job. I mean, there's DDoS. We hit new records for DDoS attacks every single year. Never seen an attack this big in our entire lives, right? When's the last time you actually had your life impacted by a DDoS attack? And so we are, as an industry, contrary to a very glum talk I read at Black Hat back in like 2016, we are, as a country, or not a country, as an industry, successfully solving a lot of security problems. So much so that we're watching cybersecurity budgets come down because people are perceiving the threat as being less. And I think that's short-sighted, but time will tell. The adversary is finding new ways to make money and is still relying on some of the old fundamentals. And fraud, nowhere more true than fraud.
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruit,
if we can get it,
right? We still can't seem to deal with that low-hanging fruit, right? But I think I see all these parallels between martial arts and the fundamentals of how to throw a punch or how to turn your hip or how a little rotation on the ball of your foot generates this many more pounds of pressure when you throw someone over your hip. Or what have you. And I do think there's a million parallels to not just what martial arts is, but also to how we teach martial arts and to how we perform cybersecurity or fraud security and how we teach it.
So, Jake, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I could go on for hours.
You had a lot of fun.
So this was Eward Driehuis for Threat Fabric. And check out other episodes of Fusion Fireside at the website www.threatfabric.com.